The nanny arrived to take care of a millionaire's son in his mansion. She froze when she saw her mother's picture in a black frame. Adriana stood outside the gates of the Dawson mansion, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen a place so vast, so intimidating. The towering gates swung open slowly, revealing a long driveway lined with ancient oak trees that led to the grand estate. The house itself was enormous, with tall windows and stone walls that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the sky. She clutched her bag tightly, reminding herself that this was just a job. She was here to be David's nanny, nothing more. Stepping inside the mansion, Adriana felt an immediate chill run down her spine. The air inside was cool, the silence almost oppressive. She was greeted by a butler who guided her through the grand hall, where portraits of the Dawson family members adorned the walls. Each face seemed to stare down at her with cold indifference. She tried to focus on the task at hand, taking care of a young boy, but the overwhelming feeling that something wasn't right was hard to shake. As the butler showed her to the living quarters, Adriana's eyes were drawn to something at the far end of the hall. A large, black-framed photo hung prominently on the wall. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she stared at the image. The woman in the photo was her mother. Adriana felt as if the ground had been pulled from beneath her feet. Her mother, who had supposedly died in a car accident when she was just a child, was here, her image displayed in the house of the Dawsons. How could this be? The shock hit her so hard she had to steady herself against the wall. "Is everything all right, miss?" the butler asked, his voice breaking through her trance. Adriana quickly composed herself, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. How could she be? Her mother, who she thought had been gone for years, was somehow connected to this family. But why? And how? The questions swirled in her mind as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. The butler continued leading her through the mansion, pointing out various rooms as they passed. Adriana, however, couldn't focus on anything he was saying. Her mind was racing. She had to find out how that photo ended up in this house. Eventually, they reached the room that would be hers. It was large, with a window that looked out over the expansive gardens. The furnishings were luxurious, far beyond anything she was used to. Adriana set her bag down on the bed, her mind still preoccupied with the photo. After the butler left, Adriana took a deep breath and sat down. She couldn't let this consume her, not yet. She had a job to do, and she needed to focus on that first. She would have time to investigate later. But the image of her mother's face staring back at her from that photo haunted her thoughts. Later that evening, Adriana met David for the first time. He was a quiet boy, no older than 6, with large, curious eyes and a shy demeanor. There was a sadness to him that Adriana immediately picked up on, though she couldn't quite place why. He seemed hesitant around her at first, but as the evening went on, he began to warm up, asking her questions about her life and where she was from. Adriana found herself smiling as they talked. It felt good to connect with him, to make him feel comfortable. Despite the strange and unsettling start to her time at the Dawson mansion, she reminded herself that her main priority was David. She was here to take care of him, to help him feel safe and secure. As the night wore on, Adriana tucked David into bed, reading him a story until his eyes grew heavy and he drifted off to sleep. She stood by his bedside for a few moments, watching him sleep peacefully. Whatever darkness lingered in this house, she would do her best to shield him from it. But as she walked back to her room, the unease returned. She couldn't get the image of her mother out of her mind. How could her mother be connected to this place? And why had no one ever told her about it? She had so many questions, but no answers. Not yet. Once in her room, Adriana sat down at the small desk by the window, her fingers nervously tapping on the wooden surface. She knew she had to find out more, but she wasn't sure where to start. The Dawsons were a powerful family, and prying into their affairs could be dangerous. Still, the image of her mother's face burned in her mind. She couldn't ignore it. Adriana made a promise to herself then and there. She would find out the truth, whatever it took. She stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling gardens below. The moonlight cast long shadows across the grounds, giving the scene an eerie beauty. Adriana knew she had stepped into a world far more complex than she had anticipated. But she was ready. Whatever secrets the Dawson family was hiding, she would uncover them. And it all started with that photo. The next morning, Adriana awoke to a soft knock on her door. She blinked away the remnants of sleep and sat up, still disoriented from the strange events of the previous day. As she dressed, her thoughts kept drifting back to the photo of her mother. She felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing down on her. After a quick breakfast, Adriana made her way to the living room, where she found Edward Dawson sitting at a large mahogany desk, his eyes focused on a pile of documents. He barely acknowledged her presence, his expression cold and distant. His demeanor only added to the mansion's unsettling atmosphere. Adriana had the urge to ask him directly about the photo, but something about his icy gaze made her hesitate. It wasn't the time, she told herself. She turned her attention back to David, who was playing quietly on the floor with a set of wooden blocks. The little boy gave her a shy smile, and Adriana felt a warm surge of affection for him. He was quiet but sweet, and she could sense that he longed for companionship. As the day went on, Adriana tried to focus on her work, but the image of her mother in the photo gnawed at her. How could her mother have been tied to the Dawson family? She had never heard of them before this job, and yet here they were, living in this grand mansion with her mother's face hanging on the wall as if she had belonged to them. The opportunity to investigate arose later in the afternoon when David fell asleep during a quiet moment in the garden. Adriana gently placed him in his bed and, with a glance over her shoulder to ensure no one was watching, decided to wander the mansion alone. The hallways of the Dawson mansion were vast and silent, the air thick with the scent of old wood and polished marble. She walked down the hall where she had seen the photograph, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. When she reached the black-framed picture, she stood still, staring at it with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. There it was again, her mother's familiar face, captured in a photo that looked decades old. Adriana's fingers trembled as she traced the edges of the frame. What connection had her mother had to this place? And why was it displayed here so prominently? Before she could gather the courage to investigate further, she heard a noise behind her, a soft clearing of the throat. Adriana whirled around, startled, and found herself face to face with an older woman, neatly dressed in a black uniform. Her silver hair was tied in a tight bun, and her sharp blue eyes scrutinized Adriana with curiosity. "You must be the new nanny," the woman said, her voice low but firm. "I'm Martha, the housekeeper. Is there something I can help you with?" Adriana hesitated, unsure of how much to say. She didn't want to reveal too much about what she had seen, especially not to someone she barely knew. But she also felt a sense of urgency to find out more about her mother's connection to the Dawson family. "I noticed this photo," Adriana began cautiously, nodding toward the picture. "The woman in it. She looks a lot like my mother." Martha's expression flickered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "That's an old photo," she said flatly. "It's been here for many years. Perhaps it's just a coincidence." Adriana didn't believe in coincidences. She wanted to push further, but Martha's tone had changed, more guarded, as if she had said more than she intended. Adriana sensed that she wouldn't get any more information from her, at least not yet. "Do you know who she was?" Adriana asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Martha shook her head. "I'm afraid I don't know the details. I've been with the Dawson family for many years, but I handle the household, not the family's history." Adriana nodded, though disappointment gnawed at her. It was clear that Martha knew more than she was letting on, but for now, Adriana would have to accept her limited answer. As Martha excused herself and walked away, Adriana stood alone in the hallway, her mind racing. The housekeeper's brief hesitation before answering had confirmed what Adriana already suspected. There was something more to this story. But for now, she would have to wait. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Adriana found it difficult to concentrate. As she read to David in the afternoon, her mind drifted back to the photo and to Martha's cryptic response. Was her mother somehow tied to the Dawson family's past? And if so, why had she never mentioned it? That evening, Adriana sat in her room, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She could feel the weight of the mansion's secrets pressing down on her, and the thought of uncovering those secrets both excited and terrified her. She knew that if she pushed too hard, she might uncover things that were best left buried, but she also knew she couldn't ignore what she had seen. The next step, Adriana decided, would be to learn more about the history of the Dawson family. If her mother had been connected to them, there would be clues somewhere in this vast house. And if the housekeeper wasn't willing to talk, perhaps the other staff would be more forthcoming. As she lay in bed that night, Adriana made a promise to herself. She would find out the truth about her mother's connection to the Dawsons, no matter what it took. The pieces were all there, she just needed to put them together. And with that thought, she drifted into an uneasy sleep, the mansion's dark past lurking in the shadows of her mind. The days in the Dawson mansion passed slowly, each one filled with a quiet sense of foreboding that Adriana couldn't shake. She had made little progress in uncovering the truth about her mother's connection to the Dawsons. Martha had become more distant, and Edward was as aloof as ever, barely acknowledging her existence unless it was to discuss something about David. But something was wrong with David. Adriana had been with him every day, and though he was polite and generally well-behaved, there was a sadness in his eyes that unnerved her. He often seemed lost in his own world, playing with his toys quietly but never really engaging with her or anyone else in the house. He avoided eye contact, and when he did speak, it was usually in whispers. Then there were the nightmares. One evening, after dinner, Adriana put David to bed as usual. She read him his favorite story, hoping it would help him relax, but she could sense his unease. His small body trembled under the covers, and his wide eyes darted nervously around the room as if he were expecting something to appear out of the shadows. Adriana tried to comfort him, gently brushing the hair from his forehead. "You're safe here, David," she whispered, hoping her words would soothe him. "I'm right outside if you need me." David nodded but didn't respond. His eyes were still wide, filled with a fear that seemed far too intense for a child his age. Adriana stayed by his side until he finally drifted off to sleep, though his face remained tense, even in slumber. That night, as Adriana lay in her own bed, she couldn't stop thinking about David's behavior. Something was clearly haunting him, something more than just childish fears. She wondered if his nightmares were connected to the same mysteries that plagued her thoughts about the house and her mother's photo. It wasn't long before her suspicions were confirmed. In the middle of the night, Adriana was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. She leapt out of bed, her heart pounding as she rushed down the hallway to David's room. The screams were coming from him, terrified, desperate cries that echoed through the mansion's empty halls. When Adriana burst into the room, she found David thrashing in his bed, his face contorted in fear. He was crying out for someone he called the lady. Adriana rushed to his side and gently shook him awake. "David, wake up. It's just a nightmare," she whispered, trying to calm him. But when his eyes snapped open, they were filled with terror. "The lady. She was here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "She came again." Adriana's blood ran cold. She knelt by his bedside, trying to keep her voice steady. "What lady, David? Who are you talking about?" David stared at her, his small body still shaking. "The lady in the white dress," he whispered. "She comes at night. She watches me." Adriana felt a chill creep down her spine. "What does she look like?" she asked softly, trying to mask her fear. David hesitated before answering, his voice barely audible. "She has long hair, dark, like yours, and she looks sad." Adriana's heart skipped a beat. Could this mysterious woman in David's nightmares be connected to the secrets of the Dawson family? Could it be her mother? She tried to dismiss the thought. It was too far-fetched, too surreal to even consider. But there was something in the way David described the woman, the long, dark hair, the sadness in her eyes, that made Adriana's mind race with possibilities. "David, I promise you, no one is going to hurt you," Adriana said softly, trying to reassure him. "I'm here and I'll make sure you're safe." David nodded, but he still looked shaken. He lay back down, clutching the edge of his blanket tightly. Adriana sat beside him until his breathing slowed, and he eventually drifted back into sleep. But even then, she could see the tension in his little body, as if he was bracing himself for another visit from the mysterious woman in his dreams. As Adriana walked back to her room, her thoughts were a tangled mess. She couldn't ignore the similarities between David's description of the woman and her mother's appearance. Could it be that David's nightmares were somehow connected to her mother's past? Was her presence still lingering in this house, trying to communicate something to David through his dreams? Adriana didn't know what to believe, but she knew one thing for sure. There was more to this house than met the eye. David's nightmares were just another piece of the puzzle, one that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The next morning, Adriana decided to bring up David's nightmares with Edward. She found him in his study, as usual, absorbed in work. She hesitated at the door, unsure of how to approach the subject. When Edward finally looked up, his eyes were distant, as if he had already dismissed her before she even spoke. "I wanted to talk to you about David," Adriana began, her voice steady but firm. Edward raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested. "Is there a problem?" "It's about his nightmares," Adriana continued, refusing to back down. "He's been having them frequently, and he mentioned something last night. Something about a woman in a white dress." For a brief moment, Adriana thought she saw something flicker in Edward's expression, a flash of recognition or concern. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by his usual stoic demeanor. "He's a child," Edward said dismissively. "Children have nightmares. It's nothing to worry about." Adriana clenched her fists, frustration bubbling inside her. "This isn't just a normal nightmare. He's seeing someone, a woman. I think it could be important." Edward stood up abruptly, cutting her off. "Drop it, Adriana," he said coldly. "David's fine. There's nothing more to discuss." With that, he turned his back on her and returned to his desk, signaling that the conversation was over. Adriana stood there for a moment, seething with frustration. She had hoped Edward would take her concerns seriously, but it was clear that he had no interest in acknowledging whatever was happening in the house, or in David's mind. But Adriana wasn't going to give up. She knew there was more to this story, and she was determined to find out what it was. David's nightmares were only the beginning. Adriana couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over her since the night of David's nightmare. The image of the woman in the white dress, as described by David, haunted her thoughts. She found herself obsessively replaying his words in her mind, trying to make sense of it all. Who was this mysterious figure? And why was she visiting David in his dreams? And why did she resemble her mother so much? Determined to uncover the truth, Adriana knew she had to confront Edward again, even though he had dismissed her concerns the last time. She needed answers about David's nightmares, about the woman, and most importantly, about her mother. But approaching Edward was no easy task. He was guarded, distant, and quick to shut down any conversation that veered too close to personal matters. The opportunity presented itself one afternoon when Adriana found Edward alone in the library. His usual stern expression softened as he thumbed through an old leather-bound book. She hesitated for a moment, watching him from the doorway. This was her chance to push for the truth. But the memory of his cold dismissal from before made her pause. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. "Edward," she called out softly. He looked up from his book, his brow furrowing slightly. "Adriana," he replied, his voice calm but not welcoming. "Is there something you need?" She nodded, walking toward him, her heart pounding. "I need to talk to you about David, about his nightmares." Edward's face hardened immediately, his jaw tightening as he closed the book with a snap. "We've already discussed this," he said, his voice clipped. "David is fine." "No, he's not," Adriana pressed, feeling her frustration rising. "You may not want to admit it, but something is very wrong. He keeps seeing this woman in his dreams, and—" "I told you to drop it," Edward interrupted, his voice growing sharper. He stood up, towering over her as if to physically end the conversation. "Children have nightmares. It's nothing to dwell on." Adriana clenched her fists at her sides, refusing to back down this time. "David described her in detail," she said, her voice rising slightly. "A woman in a white dress, with long dark hair. She watches him, and he's terrified of her. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Edward's expression flickered again, just like it had the first time she brought up the nightmares. Adriana could see it now. He recognized the description. But just as quickly, he masked his emotions, his face returning to its usual stoicism. "This conversation is over," he said, turning away from her. "No, it's not." Adriana's voice was louder now, echoing through the quiet library. She couldn't let him shut her down again. "I know you're hiding something, Edward. This woman, who is she? Why does David keep seeing her?" Edward froze, his back still to her. For a long moment the room was silent, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Adriana could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears as she waited for his response, her breath caught in her throat. Finally, Edward turned around, his face as unreadable as ever, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Anger? Fear? She couldn't tell. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said quietly, though his voice was tight with restrained emotion. "There's nothing here for you to understand." Adriana took a step closer, her voice softer now but still firm. "I saw the photo, Edward," she said. "The one in the hall. That's my mother in that picture, isn't it?" Edward's eyes flashed, and for a brief second, Adriana thought she had finally broken through his armor. But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened again. "You're mistaken," he said coldly. "Your mother has no connection to this family." Adriana felt a surge of frustration. She was so close, but Edward was refusing to give her the truth. She took a deep breath, her mind racing for the right words. She couldn't afford to lose this moment. "Please," she said quietly, her voice almost pleading now. "Just tell me the truth. Why is my mother's photo in your house? Why is David seeing her in his dreams? There's something going on here, and I need to know what it is." For a long moment, Edward didn't respond. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on hers, the tension between them growing thicker by the second. Adriana could see the conflict in his expression, the desire to keep his secrets hidden versus the weight of the truth that was clearly burning inside him. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice low and strained. "There are things about this family that you can't know, things that are better left in the past." Adriana shook her head. "I deserve to know, Edward. This isn't just about your family. This is about mine, too. My mother, she's connected to all of this, isn't she?" Edward looked at her, his expression tight with frustration and something else. Regret, perhaps. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by a sharp cry. Adriana's heart leaped into her throat. "David!" she gasped, bolting toward the door. Edward was right behind her as they raced up the stairs to David's room. When they burst through the door, they found him sitting up in bed, trembling and pale. His sheets were tangled around him, and a glass of water had fallen from his nightstand, shattering on the floor. Adriana rushed to his side, kneeling beside the bed. "David, what happened? Are you okay?" David's eyes were wide with fear as he clutched his blanket tightly. "She was here again," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The lady, she was here." Adriana felt a cold chill creep down her spine. She glanced up at Edward, who stood frozen by the door, his face ashen. Whatever he had been hiding, it was clear that David's nightmares were more than just the imaginings of a frightened child. Edward took a deep breath, his eyes still on David. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and filled with a resigned weight. "There's more to this than you know," he admitted, his words barely above a whisper. "But you're right. It's time you learned the truth." The next morning, Adriana awoke with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Edward's final words the night before echoed in her mind. "It's time you learned the truth." But what truth? What had he been hiding, and why had it taken so long for him to admit that something was wrong? As she prepared for the day, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. David's nightmares weren't just the typical fears of a child. They were connected to something much deeper, something from the past. And now, Edward was ready to reveal what that something was. Adriana just hoped she was prepared for whatever she was about to learn. After breakfast, she found Edward waiting for her in the library. The heavy curtains were drawn back, allowing streams of sunlight to pour into the room. But despite the brightness, the atmosphere felt heavy and foreboding. He was standing by the large oak desk, his hands resting on a stack of old and weathered letters. Adriana's heart skipped a beat as she approached him, her eyes drawn to the faded papers. "These," Edward said quietly, gesturing to the letters, "are what you've been looking for. They're the key to understanding everything." Adriana swallowed hard, her eyes flicking from the letters to Edward's face. "What are they?" she asked, though she had a feeling she already knew the answer. "They're letters from your mother," Edward said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "Letters she wrote to me, years ago." Adriana felt a chill run down her spine. Letters from her mother. How had Edward had these all along, and why had he kept them hidden? She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she was ready to read them, but the need for answers was too strong. She reached for the stack of letters, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the first one. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. As Adriana unfolded it, she felt as though she were holding a piece of her past that had been lost for so long. "Dear Edward," the letter began. "I don't know how to explain everything that's happened, but I need you to understand why I've made the choices I have. It wasn't just about you, or even about me. It was about protecting her, our daughter." Adriana's heart stopped. She read the words over and over again, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. Our daughter. Her mother had written these words to Edward, about her. She looked up at Edward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What is this? What does this mean?" Edward sighed heavily, his eyes clouded with a mix of regret and sorrow. "Your mother, Teresa, and I, we were more than just acquaintances. We were married. We were in love. And you, Adriana, you are our daughter." Adriana felt the floor shift beneath her, as though the world she had known had suddenly crumbled away. "No," she breathed, shaking her head in disbelief. "That's impossible. My mother, she died when I was a child." Edward's expression softened, and he looked at her with a sadness she hadn't seen in him before. "That's what you were told, but it wasn't the truth. Your mother didn't die in a car accident. Her death was faked, and she was forced to leave you behind, to protect you." Adriana's hands trembled as she clutched the letter, her mind spinning with the weight of the revelation. "Why would she do that?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why would she leave me?" Edward ran a hand through his hair, clearly struggling with the explanation. "It was because of my family. The Dawsons, we've always been powerful, and with that power came enemies. Your mother discovered something dangerous, and she knew that if she stayed, both of you would be at risk. She made the hardest decision of her life. She left to keep you safe." Adriana felt tears welling up in her eyes as she processed his words. Everything she had believed about her past had been a lie. Her mother hadn't abandoned her out of neglect or accident. She had done it out of love, out of a desperate attempt to protect her daughter from a danger Adriana hadn't even known existed. She glanced down at the letter again, the words blurring through her tears. The rest of the letter spoke of her mother's love for both Adriana and Edward, of the life they had shared before everything fell apart. Teresa had never stopped caring for them, even after she was forced to leave. Adriana felt a sharp pang of sorrow for the mother she had never truly known. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why did you let me grow up believing she was dead?" Edward's face hardened slightly, though there was still regret in his eyes. "I wanted to, but it wasn't that simple. There were people watching, people who would have done anything to destroy us if they knew the truth. Your mother made me promise to keep you safe, to let you live your life without the shadow of our family hanging over you." Adriana shook her head, her emotions swinging between anger and sorrow. "But I didn't live my life. I grew up wondering why I had no family. I spent my whole childhood feeling like something was missing, and now I find out that I had a family all along." Edward stepped closer, his expression softening. "I'm sorry, Adriana. I know it wasn't fair to you. I've carried that guilt for years. But your mother and I, we did what we thought was best." Adriana wiped at her eyes, trying to make sense of the flood of emotions overwhelming her. The weight of the past was crashing down on her, and yet there was still so much she didn't understand. She looked back at the letters, her fingers tracing the faded ink. "Is this why David's been seeing her in his dreams?" she asked softly. "Because she's connected to this house, to this family." Edward hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know that this house has a way of holding on to the past, whether we like it or not." Adriana's heart ached as she glanced out the window, the weight of her mother's sacrifice settling heavily on her shoulders. There were still so many questions left unanswered, but at least now she knew the truth about her origins. "I need to find her," Adriana whispered, her voice resolute. "I need to know what happened to her." Edward nodded, his expression solemn. "We'll find her, Adriana, together." As Adriana clutched the letters tightly, she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger journey. She had uncovered the truth about her past, but now she had to confront the reality of what that meant, and the dangers that still lurked in the shadows. Adriana could barely sleep that night. The weight of the revelation, Edward was her father and her mother's death had been faked, kept her awake, her mind racing through a maze of emotions. The letters had opened a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through, but now there was no turning back. Her mother had sacrificed everything to protect her, and Adriana knew she had to honor that sacrifice by uncovering the full truth. The next morning, she found Edward in the study, already going through old documents. His face was tired, as if the burden of the past was finally catching up to him. Adriana joined him, feeling the tension between them. Although he had promised to help her, she knew there was still much he hadn't told her. "I've been looking through some of my father's old papers," Edward said as she entered. He gestured to the piles of documents scattered across the desk. "Your mother, Teresa, she was involved in something bigger than we initially thought. It wasn't just about protecting you. She stumbled upon something that put all of us in danger." Adriana sat down across from him, her heart pounding in her chest. "What was it?" Edward handed her a folder, its edges frayed with age. Adriana opened it slowly, revealing pages of legal documents and business contracts, all with the Dawson family's name attached. But as she flipped through the papers, she noticed something strange. There were names she didn't recognize, signatures that didn't belong to any of the Dawson family members she knew of. "These people," Edward said, pointing to the unfamiliar names, "were part of a business deal my father was involved in. But it wasn't legal. It was dangerous, and it had to do with smuggling, something I wasn't even aware of at the time. Adriana's breath caught in her throat. Smuggling? Smuggling what? Edward sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of it all was too much to bear. Weapons. My father was involved in illegal arms deals, and Teresa found out. She had no idea what she was stepping into. She thought it was just a family secret. But when she tried to confront him, things spiraled out of control. Adriana's hands trembled as she held the documents. This wasn't what she had expected. Her mother had been caught up in something far more dangerous than a family dispute. So, she left, to protect me from this. Edward nodded grimly. She had no choice. If she had stayed, they would have come after both of you. My father had powerful connections, and once Teresa threatened to expose everything, she became a target. Adriana's mind raced. Her mother had been forced into hiding to protect her from dangerous criminals, and her father, Edward, had been powerless to stop it. She felt a wave of anger rising in her chest. How had her life been so deeply affected by choices she hadn't even known about? And why had her father kept this from her for so long? "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" she demanded, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why did you let me believe she was dead?" Edward looked at her, his face etched with guilt. "I didn't want to drag you into it, Adriana. I thought, if you didn't know, you could have a normal life, away from the dangers of my family. But now I see that keeping this from you was a mistake." Adriana stared at him, her emotions swirling between anger and sadness. Part of her wanted to lash out at him for the years of lies, but another part understood that he had been trying, in his own flawed way, to protect her. Still, it didn't erase the pain she felt. "I had a right to know," she whispered. "She was my mother." Edward nodded, his expression heavy with regret. "You're right, and I'm sorry. But now that you know the truth, we need to find out what happened to her. If she's still alive, we need to know where she is." Adriana took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She couldn't let her emotions cloud her judgment. Not now. There was still so much they didn't know, and the dangers her mother had faced might still be lurking in the shadows. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Edward handed her another folder. "There's one more thing you need to see. This is the last letter she sent me before she disappeared completely. After this, I never heard from her again." Adriana took the letter, her hands shaking as she unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was her mother's, neat but hurried, as if she had written it in a moment of panic. "Edward," the letter began, "I don't have much time. They're closing in on me, and I can't stay in one place for long. I've done everything I can to keep Adriana safe, but I fear my time is running out. If anything happens to me, please take care of her. She's the only thing that matters now. You need to know that I've left clues in the house, hidden in places only you would know. Find them, and you'll understand everything. But be careful. They're still watching." Adriana's heart pounded in her chest as she read the final lines. "Clues in the house," she murmured, glancing up at Edward. He nodded. "I think she's talking about this mansion. There are places I haven't looked in years. Hidden compartments, secret rooms. My family's been using this house for generations. Who knows what's been hidden here?" Adriana stood up, her resolve hardening. "Then we need to find them. Whatever she left behind, it's our only chance to understand what really happened." Together, Adriana and Edward began searching the mansion, combing through the rooms, closets, and old furniture. Edward showed her places he remembered from his childhood, hidden compartments in the walls, secret drawers in the old cabinets. They worked in silence. Both of them focused on finding the clues Teresa had left behind. It wasn't until late in the evening, when Adriana was searching through an old wardrobe in one of the guest rooms, that she found something. Tucked away behind a false panel, she discovered a small box, its surface covered in dust. Her hands trembled as she pulled it out and carefully opened it. Inside were more letters, dozens of them. Some were from her mother, but others were addressed to her mother, written by someone else. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as she read the name on the first letter. James Dawson. Edward was beside her in an instant, his face pale as he looked at the letters. "My father," he whispered. These are his letters to Teresa." Adriana's heart raced as she pulled out one of the letters and began reading. The words on the page revealed a side of the Dawson family she hadn't expected, a side filled with manipulation, threats, and betrayal. James Dawson had been the one behind the smuggling operation, and when Teresa had found out, he had tried to silence her. He was the one who made her disappear, Adriana whispered, her voice shaking. "Your father. He's the reason she had to leave." Edward looked devastated, his eyes dark with the realization of what his own father had done. "I had no idea," he muttered. "I knew he was involved in illegal dealings, but I never thought—" Adriana clutched the letters tightly, feeling the full weight of the truth settling over her. The pieces were finally coming together, but with each new discovery, the danger seemed to grow. "We need to be careful," Edward said, his voice low and filled with urgency. "If my father was capable of this, there may still be people watching us, people who don't want us to uncover the truth." Adriana nodded, her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't afraid. Not anymore. They had come this far, and now there was no turning back. Adriana sat in the quiet of the mansion's drawing room, the weight of the letters she and Edward had uncovered sitting heavily in her lap. The revelations were overwhelming. Her mother, Teresa, had been forced to leave because of the dangerous illegal dealings of Edward's father, James Dawson. Worse yet, James had been the one who orchestrated her disappearance, silencing her before she could expose the truth about the Dawson family's criminal activities. The more she learned, the more Adriana's heart ached. Her mother hadn't just left her. She had sacrificed everything to protect Adriana from a life of danger, caught in the crossfire of a powerful family's darkest secrets. Edward sat across from her, his hands clasped together, his face pale. He had spent the last few days unraveling the sins of his own father, discovering truths he had never wanted to face. But now that it was all laid out in front of him, he had no choice but to confront the past. "We can't stop now," Adriana said, breaking the heavy silence. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of determination that surprised even her. "We need to find out what really happened to my mother. We know she was forced into hiding, but is she still alive?" Edward nodded slowly, though the weight of the question seemed to press down on him. "I've been thinking about that. If she left clues for us here, then maybe she was planning to come back one day. Maybe she didn't think it was safe yet." Adriana looked out the window, her gaze fixed on the sprawling gardens below. The thought that her mother might still be out there somewhere, alive, waiting, sent a jolt of hope through her. But with that hope came fear. If her mother was still alive, why hadn't she reached out? Had something gone wrong? "What do we do now?" she asked, turning her attention back to Edward. "There has to be more that we haven't found yet." Edward rubbed his temples, deep in thought. "There are a few more places we haven't checked. My father had a study in the east wing of the house that he rarely used. He kept it locked, but I know where the key is. If there are any more documents, they'll be there." Adriana felt a surge of urgency. Every step they took brought them closer to the truth, and she couldn't stop now. She had to know what had happened to her mother, and she needed to find out if Teresa was still alive somewhere, waiting for the danger to pass. They made their way to the east wing of the mansion, a part of the house Adriana had rarely ventured into. The long, dimly lit hallways felt different, colder, more foreboding than the rest of the estate. It was as if the secrets hidden here had left an imprint on the very walls. When they reached the door to James Dawson's study, Edward hesitated for a moment, his hand resting on the brass doorknob. "I haven't been in here since before my father died. I don't know what we'll find, but I'm prepared for it. Adriana nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. Let's do it. Edward unlocked the door, and together they stepped into the study. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tight, casting the space in shadows. Dust coated the furniture, and the air smelled stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. They moved cautiously, searching the room for anything that might lead them closer to the answers they sought. Edward went straight to the large mahogany desk, rummaging through drawers and sifting through stacks of old papers. Adriana, meanwhile, was drawn to a large bookshelf that covered the far wall. Her fingers skimmed over the spines of the old books, looking for anything out of place. Her eyes caught on a small, leather-bound journal tucked between two thick volumes. It was nearly invisible, hidden away so carefully that she almost missed it. She pulled the journal from the shelf and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the first few pages. It wasn't a book. It was a diary. Her mother's diary. "Edward," she called softly, her voice shaking as she held up the journal. "I think I found something." He crossed the room quickly, his eyes widening as he saw what she was holding. "Is that?" Adriana nodded, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. "It's her writing. My mother's." Together, they sat down and began reading. The diary chronicled Teresa's final months in the Dawson mansion, from the moment she discovered James's illegal dealings to the day she fled to protect Adriana. Her entries were filled with fear and heartache, but there was also hope. Hope that one day, she would be reunited with her daughter. "I don't know how much longer I can stay hidden." One entry read, "James is growing suspicious, and I fear he'll discover what I know. But I can't leave Adriana behind. I've arranged for her to be taken somewhere safe, but my heart breaks every time I think of her growing up without me. I only hope she'll forgive me one day." Adriana felt tears prick her eyes as she read the words. Her mother had been so close to being found out, yet she had continued to fight for Adriana's safety. It was clear that Teresa had loved her deeply, even in the face of overwhelming danger. As they neared the final pages of the diary, Adriana's heart raced. There was one last entry, hastily written, the ink smudged in places. "They're coming for me. I don't have much time. I've left instructions with Edward to protect Adriana, but I fear it may not be enough. If anyone finds this journal, please know that everything I've done was for her. I won't let James destroy my family, not without a fight." Adriana closed the diary, her hands shaking. The last entry was dated only a few days before Teresa had disappeared. It was clear now, Teresa had left, not just to protect Adriana, but to take a stand against the Dawson family's corruption. Edward's face was pale as he looked at her. "I had no idea how much she had been fighting behind the scenes," he whispered. "She was braver than I ever gave her credit for." Adriana nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "She was trying to save us. And now we need to find out where she went." Edward stood, determination filling his expression. "We will. And if my father's crimes are still casting a shadow over this family, we'll bring them to light." Together, they knew they had to finish what Teresa had started. They had to find out if she was still alive, and more importantly, they had to bring justice to those who had forced her into hiding. As they left the study, Adriana felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt before. The truth about her mother was within reach, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered it all. The discovery of Teresa's diary gave Adriana a new sense of urgency. Every word, every entry, had painted a picture of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her daughter and paid the ultimate price to protect her. Adriana couldn't help but feel closer to her mother now, even though she was still separated by the fog of the past. But something told her that Teresa's story wasn't over. Not yet. There was still a chance she could be alive, and Adriana was determined to find her. Over the next few days, Adriana and Edward searched every corner of the mansion, looking for more clues that Teresa might have left behind. They revisited every hidden compartment, every forgotten room, and every piece of furniture that might hold a secret. It was a slow process, but Adriana refused to give up. She could feel it. There was more to discover. One afternoon, while searching in the attic, Adriana found an old chest tucked away behind a pile of dusty boxes. Its lock was rusted, and the wood was worn, as if it had been untouched for years. Adriana called Edward over, and together they pried it open. Inside the chest was a collection of documents, old photographs, and letters, more pieces of the puzzle. But what caught Adriana's attention most was a small, leather-bound notebook that lay at the bottom of the chest. It was different from the diary she had found earlier, smaller and less worn. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the first page. The handwriting was familiar. It was her mother's. As she flipped through the pages, her heart raced. This notebook was different from the diary. It wasn't personal thoughts or feelings. It was a record of Teresa's last movements before she disappeared. The entries were short and to the point, detailing where she had gone, who she had met with, and what she had discovered about James Dawson's illegal dealings. Adriana's fingers trembled as she read through the entries. Each one revealed more about the danger Teresa had been in, but also about her determination to bring down the criminal network James had built. It was clear now. Teresa had been working in secret, gathering evidence to expose the Dawson family's corruption, but she had never had the chance to finish what she started. One entry, in particular, stood out to Adriana. It was dated only a week before her mother had disappeared. "I've made contact with someone who can help. They know about James's operations, and they have the power to bring him down. But I can't trust anyone, not yet. I need more proof before I hand everything over. I'll be meeting them at the safe house in a few days. If something happens to me, I've left everything they need hidden here. Adriana, if you ever find this, know that I did this for you. I love you, always." Adriana's breath caught in her throat. The safe house. It had to be where Teresa had gone before she disappeared. But where was it? "Edward, look at this," Adriana said, handing him the notebook. "She mentions a safe house. Do you know where that could be?" Edward furrowed his brow, flipping through the pages. "I remember hearing something about a property my father kept off the books. It was a small cabin in the woods, not far from here. He used it for private meetings, away from prying eyes. But I haven't been there in years." Adriana's pulse quickened. "Do you think that's where she went?" "It's possible," Edward said, his expression darkening. "If she was meeting someone in secret, that's where she would have gone." Adriana stood up, her resolve strengthening. "We need to go there. It could be the key to finding out what really happened to her." Edward hesitated for a moment, his face clouded with worry. "If this place was tied to my father's operations, it could still be dangerous. There might be people watching it, waiting for anyone to come snooping around." Adriana shook her head. "I don't care. We have to go. This is our only lead, and I'm not going to sit around waiting for answers." Edward saw the determination in her eyes and finally nodded. "All right, we'll go. But we'll need to be careful. If anyone is still involved in my father's old network, they won't hesitate to stop us." Later that afternoon, they packed a small bag with supplies and set out for the safe house. The drive through the dense woods was tense, the quiet of the forest amplifying the weight of their mission. Edward hadn't been to the cabin in years, but as they neared the location, the memories came flooding back. "This is it," Edward said quietly, as they pulled up to a small clearing. The cabin was barely visible through the trees, its wooden frame weathered and covered in moss. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time. But Adriana's gut told her that this place held the answers they were looking for. They approached the cabin cautiously, every sound in the forest making Adriana's heart race. The air was thick with tension as Edward unlocked the door, the creaking of the old hinges echoing through the quiet woods. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the furniture covered in dust. It looked like no one had been there in years. Adriana's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that might stand out. There were papers scattered on a table in the corner, old books on a shelf, but nothing that seemed important. Then, as she turned toward the back of the cabin, she noticed something strange, a floorboard that looked out of place. "Edward, over here," Adriana called, kneeling down to inspect the floor. She pried up the loose board, revealing a small compartment underneath. Inside, there was a metal box, its surface covered in dust. Adriana's hands shook as she lifted it out and opened it. Inside the box were several documents, more evidence of James Dawson's criminal operations. But there was something else, an envelope addressed to Adriana. She stared at it for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Slowly, she opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Adriana." The letter began, "If you're reading this, it means I couldn't make it back to you. I'm so sorry I had to leave you, but I hope you'll understand why. I did everything I could to protect you from the dangers that surrounded us. If I couldn't be there to watch over you, I hope this letter will give you the answers you've been searching for." Adriana's hands trembled as she continued to read. The letter detailed everything her mother had done to expose James Dawson's illegal activities, how she had tried to protect Adriana from the fallout, and how she had been planning to return for her once it was safe. "I love you more than anything in this world," the letter concluded. "I hope you can forgive me for leaving. Please know that everything I did was for you." Adriana clutched the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had fought so hard, sacrificed so much, all to keep her safe. And now, finally, she understood the full extent of that sacrifice. Edward stood beside her, his expression somber as he read the documents in the metal box. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is the proof. Everything we need to take down what's left of my father's operation." Adriana nodded, her tears drying as a new resolve took hold of her. "Then we're going to finish what my mother started. We're going to expose the truth." The drive back from the cabin was silent. The weight of what Adriana had discovered in her mother's letter sat heavy on her chest. She kept the letter folded tightly in her hand, as if letting go of it might somehow make everything unravel. Her mind raced with the gravity of what lay ahead. Teresa had left everything behind to protect her, to shield her from the darkness of the Dawson family's legacy. And now, Adriana found herself tangled in the very web her mother had fought so hard to escape. As the car rolled back into the driveway of the Dawson mansion, the large estate that had once felt cold and imposing now seemed even more haunted. There were ghosts here, ghosts of the past, of secrets, and of lies that had twisted her life into something unrecognizable. Edward turned off the engine and sat quietly beside her. He hadn't spoken much since they had left the cabin, and Adriana could sense that he was grappling with his own internal storm. His father's involvement in illegal arms smuggling, the betrayal of his own family, and now, the guilt of not protecting Teresa when he had the chance. It all weighed heavily on him. And now, he was facing the consequences of those choices. "We can't stay here," Adriana finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet, but firm. "If people find out that we have these documents, they'll come after us, just like they came after her." Edward nodded, but his gaze was distant. "You're right. We'll need to be careful. There are still people connected to my father's operations, people who won't want this information getting out." Adriana looked down at the letter in her hand, her thumb tracing the edge of the paper. "Do you think she's still alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward hesitated, his face filled with uncertainty. "I don't know. I want to believe she is, but after all these years, I can't be sure." The uncertainty gnawed at Adriana. The hope that her mother might still be alive felt fragile, like a delicate thread she was afraid to pull too hard. But if there was even the slightest chance, she had to keep searching. Inside the mansion, the tension between Adriana and Edward grew heavier. The closer they got to the truth, the more difficult their relationship became. Adriana couldn't help but feel anger bubbling inside her. Anger at the secrets Edward had kept from her, at the choices he had made that had allowed her mother to disappear without a trace. She knew he had been trying to protect her, but it didn't erase the years she had spent feeling lost and abandoned. "I trusted you," she said suddenly, her voice sharp as they stood in the hallway. "I trusted you to tell me the truth. And all this time, you knew more than you were letting on." Edward flinched at her words, his expression darkening. "It wasn't that simple, Adriana. I was trying to protect you." "Protect me?" she interrupted, her voice rising with emotion. "You didn't protect me. You let me live in the dark, wondering what happened to my mother while you knew there was more to the story." Edward took a step toward her, his hands clenched at his sides. "I didn't know everything, Adriana. I didn't know my father had done this. I didn't know he was responsible for Teresa's disappearance. Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to find out that my father was capable of this?" Adriana stared at him, her heart pounding. She wanted to yell, to scream at him for the years of silence, for the lies, for the pain that had been buried under layers of secrets. But she couldn't. She could see the pain in his eyes, the regret that had been building up inside him for years. "I'm sorry," Edward said, his voice softening. "I should have told you more. I should have trusted you with the truth. But I thought if I kept it hidden, if I kept you safe, you wouldn't have to deal with all of this." Adriana felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to let them fall. "You didn't keep me safe. You just kept me in the dark." The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Adriana could feel the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on her, threatening to crush her under its weight. But at the same time, she knew they couldn't afford to let this tear them apart. They were on the same side now, fighting for the same goal, to uncover the truth and to finish what Teresa had started. "We need to work together," Adriana said finally, her voice steady. "Whatever happens next, we need to be on the same page. We can't let this tear us apart." Edward nodded, though the pain in his eyes hadn't faded. "You're right. We have to finish this." As they stood there in the hallway, the mansion around them seemed to grow even colder. The weight of the past still loomed over them, but now they had a direction. They had the documents, they had the proof, and they had each other. But Adriana couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. If James Dawson's associates found out what they were doing, they wouldn't hesitate to stop them, just as they had tried to stop Teresa all those years ago. The danger was closer than ever, and Adriana could feel it closing in on them. That night, as Adriana lay in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about her mother. Every memory she had of Teresa felt distant, like a dream she could barely grasp. But now, with the letters and the documents, her mother's presence felt closer, more real. She could almost hear her voice, almost feel her touch. Adriana clutched the letter to her chest, closing her eyes as the tears finally began to fall. She had spent so many years wondering, searching, and now she was finally starting to understand. Her mother had been a fighter, someone who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's safety. And now Adriana knew she had to live up to that legacy. She couldn't stop now. She had to finish what her mother had started. The next morning, Adriana and Edward gathered in the study once again, the stack of documents and letters laid out in front of them. They had a plan: take the evidence to the authorities, expose the illegal dealings that had been hidden for so long, and bring down what was left of James Dawson's network. But as they prepared to leave, a knock echoed through the mansion, sharp and insistent. Adriana and Edward exchanged a glance, both of them tensing. They hadn't been expecting anyone. Slowly, Edward moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the handle. When he opened it, two men stood on the other side, their expressions cold and calculating. "Edward Dawson," one of the men asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We need to talk." Adriana felt her heart drop. She knew immediately who they were. James Dawson's associates had finally found them. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen at the sight of the two men at the door. There was no mistaking who they were, remnants of James Dawson's criminal network. They were here, and they had come for the documents. Her heart pounded in her chest as fear coursed through her veins. Edward, standing in the doorway, kept his expression neutral, though Adriana could sense the tension radiating from him. "We're not here for a conversation, Mr. Dawson," one of the men said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you. Hand it over, and this can all be over quickly." Adriana glanced at Edward, her mind racing. The documents, the evidence they had gathered, were their only chance to expose the truth. But these men clearly knew about them. If they handed the papers over, all of Teresa's sacrifices would be for nothing. And if they didn't, who knew what these men were capable of? Edward's eyes flickered toward Adriana for a split second, a silent message passing between them. He couldn't hand the documents over. They had come too far to give up now. Slowly, he stepped back from the door, his voice calm but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about," Edward said, keeping his tone steady. "There's nothing here for you." The man's expression hardened, his jaw clenching as he stepped forward, pushing the door open wider. "Don't play games with us. We know about the documents. You've been digging where you shouldn't have." Adriana's heart raced as the second man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. She knew they couldn't let these men find what they were looking for. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to hide, but she stood her ground, refusing to back down. "We don't want any trouble," Edward said, his voice still steady, though Adriana could hear the tension beneath the surface. "But we're not giving you anything." The first man let out a low chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't a negotiation." Before anyone could react, the second man reached for something inside his jacket, something metallic that gleamed in the dim light of the mansion. Adriana's heart dropped as she realized what was happening. A gun. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as the man leveled the gun at Edward, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "Give us the documents. Now." Time seemed to slow down as Adriana's mind raced. She needed to do something, anything, to stop this from spiraling out of control. Her eyes darted to the desk where the papers were hidden, then back to Edward, whose gaze remained fixed on the man in front of him. "I know where they are," Adriana blurted out suddenly, her voice shaking but loud enough to draw the men's attention. Both of them turned toward her, surprised by her sudden outburst. Edward's eyes widened, but Adriana gave him a subtle shake of her head, trying to convey her plan. She needed to stall, to buy them some time. "I'll get them for you," she said quickly, her heart pounding in her chest. Just don't hurt anyone." The man with the gun hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "You better not be lying," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm not," Adriana said, her voice trembling. "They're upstairs. I'll go get them." The two men exchanged a glance, then nodded. "Go," the first man said. "But don't take too long. We're not patient." Adriana turned and quickly made her way toward the staircase, her mind racing as she ascended the steps. She needed to think of something, some way to get out of this without handing over the documents. As she reached the top of the stairs, she took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She knew the layout of the house well by now. There was a small, hidden compartment in the wall of the upstairs study, one she and Edward hadn't explored yet. It wasn't large enough to hide all the documents, but maybe, just maybe, it could hold the most important ones. As she reached the study, Adriana quickly made her way to the hidden compartment, her fingers fumbling as she pried it open. Inside was just enough space to tuck away a few key papers, the ones that directly implicated James Dawson in the illegal operations. She shoved the documents inside and sealed the compartment, her heart pounding in her chest. Now came the hard part. She grabbed a handful of old, irrelevant papers from the desk, papers that would look convincing enough from a distance, and hurried back downstairs. She could feel the weight of the men's gaze on her as she re-entered the room, holding the stack of papers tightly in her hands. "Here," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "These are the documents you're looking for." The man with the gun stepped forward, snatching the papers from her hands. He rifled through them quickly, his eyes scanning the pages. Adriana held her breath, praying that he wouldn't notice the missing files. After what felt like an eternity, the man grunted and tucked the papers under his arm. "This better be everything," he said, his tone threatening. "It is," Adriana lied, her heart still pounding. The men exchanged a glance, then finally backed toward the door. "We'll be watching you," the first man warned, his eyes locking onto Edward's. "If we find out you've been holding anything back, we won't be so polite next time." With that, they turned and left, the heavy door slamming shut behind them. The tension in the room lingered, thick and suffocating. Adriana let out a shaky breath, her knees weak with relief. Edward moved toward her, his expression filled with a mixture of shock and gratitude. "That was close," he murmured, his voice low. "You saved us." Adriana shook her head, her hands still trembling. "I just bought us time. They'll figure it out eventually. We need to act fast." Edward nodded, understanding the urgency. "We need to take the real documents to the authorities. We can't wait any longer." Adriana glanced toward the stairs, where the hidden compartment held the crucial evidence that could bring down the remnants of James Dawson's criminal empire. "We'll get them," she said, her voice steady, "and then we'll finish this, for good." Edward looked at her, his expression filled with determination. "For Teresa," he said quietly. Adriana nodded, feeling the weight of her mother's legacy pressing down on her. For her. With the danger looming closer than ever, Adriana knew they had no choice but to move quickly. The time for hiding was over. Now, it was time to fight. The tension in the mansion hung thick in the air as Adriana and Edward made their final preparations. The documents were safely hidden upstairs, but they knew it wouldn't be long before the men realized they had been deceived. The threat was real, and the stakes had never been higher. Adriana could feel the weight of her mother's legacy pressing down on her. She had to finish what Teresa had started. "We don't have much time," Edward said, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get these documents to someone we can trust before they come back." Adriana nodded, her mind racing through their options. The authorities would be their best bet, but they needed someone who wasn't connected to the Dawson family, someone who wouldn't be influenced by the power and corruption that had plagued their name for so long. "There's a lawyer," Edward said suddenly. "An old friend of my mother's. He's one of the few people my father never managed to corrupt. If we can get the documents to him, he can take them to the authorities without any interference." Adriana felt a glimmer of hope. "Do you trust him?" "With my life," Edward said. "He's the only person I know who will make sure justice is served." They quickly gathered the real documents from the hidden compartment upstairs, their movements quick and deliberate. Adriana's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers that could finally expose the truth about James Dawson's criminal empire. This was it, the moment they had been fighting for. As they prepared to leave the mansion, a sense of dread settled over Adriana. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something dangerous. The two men had made it clear that they weren't going to let this go easily, and she knew they would be watching. They had to move quickly and carefully. Just as they stepped outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel sent a jolt of fear through Adriana's chest. A black car pulled up to the front gate, its headlights cutting through the twilight. Edward's face went pale as the car door opened, and the two men from earlier stepped out, their expressions cold and determined. "They're back," Edward muttered under his breath. "We need to go. Now!" Adriana's heart raced as she and Edward ducked behind the side of the mansion, trying to avoid being seen. They couldn't let the men get their hands on the documents. Everything depended on getting them to safety. As they moved quietly along the side of the house, Adriana could hear the men's voices, sharp and angry. "They're hiding something," one of the men said. "I knew those papers were fake. They think they can outsmart us, but we're going to find them." Adriana's breath quickened as she realized how close they were. If the men found them now, everything would be lost. She glanced at Edward, whose face was set in grim determination. "We'll have to make a run for it," Edward whispered. "The car is parked at the back. If we can make it there without them seeing us, we'll have a chance." Adriana nodded, her body tense with adrenaline. They moved quickly, keeping low as they made their way around the mansion. Every step felt like it stretched out into eternity, the fear of being caught looming over them like a dark cloud. Finally, they reached the car, and Edward quickly unlocked it, motioning for Adriana to get in. Just as they were about to pull away, the sound of footsteps behind them made Adriana's blood run cold. "There they are!" The shout came from one of the men, and before Adriana could react, she saw him raise a gun, pointing it directly at them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ducked down, fear gripping her body. "Go!" she shouted at Edward, her voice filled with panic. Edward slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as the car sped down the driveway. Adriana's pulse raced as they careened toward the front gate, the black car close behind them. "They're following us!" Adriana shouted, glancing in the rearview mirror. The men were gaining on them, their car speeding dangerously close. Edward's face was grim as he swerved onto the main road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Hold on," he said, his voice tense. "We can lose them if we get to the city." Adriana's heart raced as they sped through the winding roads, the landscape blurring around them. The black car was still behind them, the men inside determined to stop them at any cost. "We need to get off the main road," Edward said, his voice tight with focus. "They'll catch up if we don't." Adriana scanned the road ahead, her mind racing. Just as they rounded a corner, she spotted a narrow side road, barely visible through the trees. "There!" she shouted, pointing to the road. Edward swerved onto the side road, the car bouncing over the uneven ground as they sped through the dense woods. The black car followed, but the narrow road made it harder for them to keep up. "We're losing them," Adriana said, her voice filled with relief as the black car began to fall back. Just as they thought they had escaped, the sound of gunshots shattered the air. Adriana's breath caught in her throat as the back window of their car shattered, glass spraying everywhere. "They're shooting at us," she gasped, ducking down as more shots rang out. Edward's face was pale with concentration as he pushed the car faster, trying to outrun their pursuers. The road was rough and winding, but they were gaining distance, the black car falling further behind with each passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the black car disappeared from view, the sound of gunfire fading into the distance. Adriana let out a shaky breath, her hands still trembling. "Did we lose them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward nodded, though his face remained tense. "For now, but we need to get to the lawyer as quickly as possible. They'll come after us again if they find us." Adriana nodded, her heart still racing. They had narrowly escaped, but the danger wasn't over yet. They had to get the documents to safety, to make sure that everything Teresa had fought for wouldn't be in vain. Hours later, they arrived at the lawyer's office, exhausted but determined. The lawyer, an older man with kind eyes, welcomed them in without hesitation. He listened carefully as Edward explained the situation, his face growing more serious with every word. "You did the right thing coming here," the lawyer said, taking the documents from them. "I'll take care of this. The authorities will be notified, and the people involved in this will be brought to justice." Adriana felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was finally over. The documents were in safe hands, and the truth would finally come out. Teresa's legacy would be honored, and the corruption that had destroyed so many lives would be exposed. As they left the lawyer's office, Adriana looked up at the sky, the weight of the past finally lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her thoughts turning to her mother. "I hope you're proud of me." Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression filled with quiet gratitude. She would be. Together, they walked into the future, leaving behind the shadows of the past. But Adriana knew that her mother's spirit would always be with her, guiding her toward a life filled with hope and justice.